So definitely feel free to use the chat to ask very specific questions, broad questions, and we'll try to keep up with those in the discussion, just because today's topic in particular, as it relates to communities, is it's going to be very unique for every community that's out there, but we do want people to share their experiences or share their questions, because I think that will add to the discussion. So yeah, all right, well, let me get started. So cancel. Actually, Joel, do you want to?
You mean to drive the slides?
Yeah, can you do that?
Sure.
Okay. Great.
All right. And then let me just make sure that that is full screen and we'll get it going.
Yeah, can you get it into like actual presentation mode without the on the side?
Just need to find it. There we go. It's gonna be a little hard because I'm actually admitting people still, Katie.
Oh,
it's gonna be hard for me to do both of those things.
Okay. Well, let me try then. Sorry about that, guys. We're going to be switching between presenters today, so I think this should work. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, thank you all for coming today. Thank you for putting your name and organization and location in the box. And like I said, feel free to write questions, situations, etc. in the box, and we'll try to address them as we go along. Especially because we're going to end today's webinar with a Q&A kind of panel between two folks. And so that might be good to have additional questions coming in at that point as well. So you guys probably all know us by now, but this is the CWCB Fluvial Hazard Zone team led by Chris Sturm and Andrea Harbin-Monahan with CWCB. And then me, I'm Katie Yacht, supported with, or at least today, by Michael and Joel. They're definitely more than supporting roles within the program, though. We're all kind of co-leaders and have been for about 10 years now. And it's crazy to think that the program is 10 years old, but it is. Presenting today, we also have Tori Jarvis and Nicole Rebick-Stout. And that they're going to be doing most of the talking today, most of the presenting, and most of the discussion. So we thank them very much for their time and their knowledge and expertise today as well. Just a quick reminder, within the Colorado Conservation Board sits the Watershed and Flood Protection section. And in that section, the two programs that we are primarily talking about within this Fluvial Futures webinar series are the Colorado Fluvial Hazard Zone program and the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. And just as a quick reminder that both of these programs function as programs, but they also function as tools to support other planning and other project implementation efforts as well. So it's a little bit of both. Sometimes it's a program, sometimes it's a tool. Just depends on kind of the context that we're thinking about this work. But, previously we spent the last two webinars talking about how the Fluvial Hazard Zone program as a tool interfaces with wildfire ready action plans out of the Wildfire Ready Watersheds program. We're changing course a little bit for the next two webinars. These are going to be primarily supporting Fluvial Hazard Zone as a program that stands alone, and talking about how communities can take the good mapping that's done, whether that mapping is done independently through a stream management plan or through a wildfire ready action plan, and adopt them at a community level for guidance into the future. So today we're going to talk about kind of the more community perspective and some of the tools that exist at the community level. And then next month on September 16th, which is actually a change of date. So if you put in the previous date into your calendar, change it. We had to move it back a week for our guest presenters who are going to be the city of Greeley. And they're going to be talking about how they have been using the Fluvial Hazard Zone mapping and tools in their Greater River Management Initiative next month. So stay tuned for that. That one's also going to be great. Quickly, if you missed the first two webinars, they're posted on our website under the Learn tab. So go there, you can watch them on YouTube. And then additionally, we will be presenting at or holding workshops both at CASFM and the Sustaining Colorado Watersheds conferences at the end of this month and the beginning of next month. So I'm going to give a quick introduction before handing it over to Tori. But we're going to start kind of thinking about what you do, in today's intent is what you do with maps once a community has them, how we can influence future decisions that are given to us by the maps and through the mapping process. So just want to roll back. In our protocol, the first step of doing any FHZ mapping is determining the goals, objectives, and applications. And I know it kind of seems like a throwaway step, but it's actually really, really important when we're talking about mapping and levels of effort and communication. And so typically for FHZ mapping, the overarching goal is to identify, communicate, and mitigate fluvial hazards or hazards that are associated with river corridor processes. However, within that goal, there's nuance and there's sub-goals. And today we're talking primarily about the mitigation aspect of that. I think the communication aspect of it could be a whole nother, a separate webinar where we actually get into some good discussions about communication strategies and what effective outreach actually looks like. But I just want to be clear that today we're primarily talking about measures intended to mitigate hazards. And so when you think about mitigating a hazard, you're either influencing the physical expression of that hazard in the landscape, or you're mitigating the impact that that hazard has on human infrastructure that we care about. And so mostly when we talk about fluvial hazard zones, we're talking about the latter. It is extremely difficult, especially during high flows, to influence the behavior of the hazard itself. And as a result, when we talk about fluvial hazard zones and riverine processes, we really tend to focus on reducing the impact of that hazard on human infrastructure and life. So that means in areas that are developed or undeveloped or lightly developed, we want to be influencing patterns of future development and preserving natural stream corridors or preserving compatible land uses within the hazard zone. Kind of as an aside, we want to also be assessing if those areas are providing a protective covering to downstream communities, because if they are, that means it's really important to preserve that existing land use and that existing land function. And then in developed or more urban areas, things look a little different. And we still are kind of focused on the idea of influencing patterns of future development or redevelopment. Sometimes that's going to be through buyouts or land conversions, and then kind of in a kind of very unique but ideal situation, we'd actually be able to restore some stream corridor function and back some development off the stream banks during redevelopment processes. There's other strategies that we might take in developed or urban areas would be looking at insurance and then potentially thinking about if we could influence the expression of those hazards in urban zones through upstream corridor restoration to either dump sediment or energy into a floodplain, or upstream watershed restoration to actually impact the kind of hydrologic response that might be being felt in the urban areas. So today, I just want to put some context on that. So today we're really talking about tools that we can use to influence patterns of future development or redevelopment, knowing that we've still got this other kind of suite of of things that's out there as well. At a high level, this is what it looks like. So in planning, kind of in the planning mapping process, FHZ maps can live in any of these types of plans and then probably more. But the idea is that the fluvial hazard zone is going to define the space of the river corridor. And then outside of that, we're going to have areas that are safer for development. And then we're going to have an understanding of what's vulnerable within already developed areas. And again, when we think about mitigation, there's going to be a difference between the approaches we take in the areas that are developed and the areas that are more lightly developed, natural or in a different like agricultural land use. Some of the tools we might use that Tori's really going to get into to influence that future development might be on the order, or might be in the realm of working with developers and land owners to incentivize development into those safer areas. This only really works if you've got land in an FHZ and land outside an FHZ, but there's a lot of different tools you can use to say, hey, on this particular property or in this subdivision, this area over here is safer, this area over here is more at risk. Is there a way that we can incentivize you to move development with more density this way, and then maybe put parks or other lighter land use or less development that's less likely to be severely damaged in a flood into the stream corridor. These are some great examples, like huge tracts of land, but the development is right up on the stream. Many other places on these properties to put homes, to put the development. This is what we're trying, with this strategy, this is what we're trying to talk about, is being like, hey, maybe we should actually move those back a little bit into a somewhat safer zone. Additionally, there's tools around, or tools that are available in local land use and procedures, not necessarily regulatory, but just in the way that development applications are reviewed. And interesting ones that I have heard about in other places are incorporating review into septic permit reviews, because sometimes that's the only place where you can actually see a review in more, or see a proposal in more rural areas. And then something else that I feel is interesting that warrants more discussion is that in some places, hazard descriptions are required on land deeds. And so as land is bought and sold, the understanding of the hazard goes with that. I think that that's both a communication thing, but also kind of an administrative tool to really help both as land is developed and redeveloped. Additionally, we've got regulatory mechanisms, which Tori is going to help us out and help us understanding the differences between some of these and the tools with those. But I also want to say that depending on the goals, a regulatory mechanism may not be the pinnacle of what a community is after in terms of how it's intending to manage its stream corridors and its hazard zones. Just a quick reminder, on our FHZ website, we have a resources tab, and on that tab we have community quick start guide, we have a model ordinance, and I think we have something else on there too to kind of support or that maybe goes through some of these ideas at a really high level. But you're definitely going to get more detail today in this webinar than what's in those information sources. But I wanted to back up a second too. And so if we're working in a community where identifying, communicating, and mitigating hazards is maybe not the goal of doing stream corridor setback or wanting to regulate the space next to a stream, if instead it's looking more like water quality, riparian habitat preservation, like trying to prevent bank erosion, or for aesthetic purposes, we may be thinking more about buffers. And I just want to throw this out there, that there is a time and a place where buffer setbacks are very effective. It is not for mitigating hazards in large flood events, but it can be effective for water quality and habitat preservation. And there can be situations in a community where you could see both a buffer setback and a fluvial hazard zone, depending on, again, kind of the overall goals and objectives. So I don't want to just throw out buffers as like ineffective or they're not something that's worth pursuing. They're definitely effective, but they're worth pursuing for a different purpose. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tori.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Katie and team. And hello, everybody. I'm assuming, let me know if you cannot hear me very well, but I think I got everything turned up, and I'm going to work on my screen share, and then I will dive in to more talking. Okay. All right, looks like everybody's seeing the PowerPoint presentation now. Cool. Okay, I'll dive in, and Katie did a really good job of setting this up. I will probably repeat some of what Katie said in a different way, in a different context, but I think that you've already heard some of the key takeaways from what I'm going to talk to you all about jumping in, but a couple of disclaimers and context, and let me introduce myself before I dive in. So as you've heard, I'm Tori Jarvis. I'm with the law firm Sullivan Green CV Jarvis. I'm emphasizing law firm because when I was looking at the comments and who's attending, I was like, oh no, it's a lot of engineers, which is wonderful. But please know, engineering folks, I'm talking very high level about this stuff. The other people that you've heard from, Katie, Joel, Michael, have a lot more expertise on the scientific and technical pieces of fluvial hazard zones. And so I may even defer to them some if there's some of those kind of technical questions, but I just wanted to set the context that what I'm here to talk about is a high level approach to regulating, in particular, to integrate fluvial hazard zones into local government regulations. And so, so there's a couple of like hypotheticals that may not match with like on the ground facts. I'm just using them from looking at mapping and that sort of thing. So I wanted to let folks know that. The other thing is our firm and I have decades of experience integrating environmental protection considerations into local regulations. And so years ago, started working with this team primarily through funding from the River Network to look at fluvial hazard zones and more theoretically, what are the options for integrating fluvial hazard zone mapping into local regulations. So the work that we've done studying this is hypothetical. Theoretical. We haven't actually worked yet with the local government to integrate this into their local regulations. Chaffee County is the first county, I think I'm saying that right, but they're the first county in Colorado to actually do that integration work. And so it's a newer field, even though you guys have been working on it a decade. But I just want to qualify this that a lot of this is our theory, our recommendations for things that could happen. We'll come back to the key takeaway that none of this is a one-size-fits-all approach. You definitely need to customize it. And so at the end, I also think it would be great to hear your reactions to some of our suggestions. None of these things are written in stone, and I think hearing from Nicole after me on Pitkin County's experiences and some of their challenges will also help ground truth some of my theories that I'm talking about. So with that, let's dive into it. All right, so Katie started out talking about mapping, and I just wanted to start there. As someone that drafts local regulations, it's almost impossible to imagine drafting an appropriate regulatory scheme for fluvial hazards if you didn't have the mapping, because it would be really difficult to understand what the problem is. And when you're regulating, it's always really important to tailor the regulations to the appropriate size and scale of whatever the problem is. And so I know that many of you have already learned that, and you have the experts on this call to conduct the mapping, and it's happening more and more around the state. But that absolutely is the first step to me, and we'll be coming back to the mapping to think about a couple of different times what the map tells you and how you might want to regulate based on what your mapping's telling you. But like I said, this map is a hypothetical, and so there is. I saw Julie is on from Eagle County. This is from Eagle County, mostly because I knew how to get into their GIS and I played around with their fluvial hazard zone mapping the most. So I started there, and I picked .0 as a good example to me of some of the issues in regulation, but this is totally hypothetical. So I don't have all the facts on the ground for Eagle County. So I'm not speaking at all on behalf of Eagle County, and some of the issues I'm talking about are just from me looking at the map. They are not, I don't know all of the details with like this little community here. But I hope that this hypothetical will be helpful to visualize some of the issues and questions you may want to think about when you're regulating. I'm realizing that I have a lot of things going on my screen, so I'm just going to take a pause to say maybe Joel or somebody, if there's a clarifying question or somebody can't hear me or something, will you just interrupt me, because I'm not going to be able to see all that stuff. I just realized.
Everything's great.
Cool. Okay. Great. All right. So anyway, a little bit more about this mapping that I see just from looking, total layperson, looking at a map, but also thinking about the land use and development piece. Many of you on this call can probably see some of the things I'm looking at, but we have this buffer, so the fluvial hazard buffer. I think that it stops right here only because the mapping is just for the Eagle River. The Colorado is coming into the Eagle River here from the north. So I think that that's the only reason this boundary is here, is just because that's where the mapping is for the Eagle. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong there, but anyway, otherwise there's this recommended buffer area where the fluvial hazard zone is identified. And what was very revealing to me is this orange, which is the disconnected active stream corridor. So this mapping is super helpful for me, a layperson, to imagine that the Colorado River could break its banks right here and scoot over to the rest of the Colorado River. So this is the Eagle River on this side. This is the Colorado River coming down, and this is the confluence becoming continuing on, I guess, as the Colorado River. So this disconnected stream corridor to me is a great example of a fluvial hazard zone that is. I did check this. The mapping is a little hard to show you all on the screen, but it's not part of the floodplain. But it is a major hazard and a consideration for all sorts of things for planning. So let's move into why it would be important to have this kind of mapping, all sorts of different planning benefits to that. But just to highlight here, it looks like if you zoom in on these roads, you can see that there are some developed existing parcels in this platted area with the roads. There are also some blank spots where perhaps there's future development still to come. And then there's all this undeveloped land. There's also undeveloped land. And of course, there's a very important major thoroughfare within the fluvial hazard zone. So those are some of the things we're thinking about when we're thinking about what kind of regulation might be appropriate. Okay, so with that map in mind, of course, that's just like one tiny little section that I thought would be useful to look at. Doesn't give us the full picture of what's happening in any county, but I think it sets the tone, and Katie talked about some of the things on this list already, but I'm here today to talk to you about regulations and how you can incorporate fluvial hazard zones into your regulations. But I think it's really important, and Katie already hit on this pretty well, to think about all the different types of planning where you could incorporate fluvial hazard zones, not just incorporating into your regulations. In particular, because local regulation is really for new development or redevelopment. If you have if most of your fluvial hazard zones are what's referred to as like built out, you're not going to have a lot more development pressure. Then local regulation may not be your avenue, but there's so many other things you can do. So you can integrate this data into your comprehensive and master plan. Even sometimes having the phrase or the word can give a lot of political will to act later. So like, you know, if you're already redoing your comprehensive or master plan, just even citing future mapping for fluvial hazard zones and integrating that into planning processes, some sort of broad statement of the importance of that can give, I think, staff a lot of cover to do work that they need in the future to address fluvial hazards. Without at all touching private development, you can really consider what kind of infrastructure is vulnerable, and especially if it's your own infrastructure, whatever the local government is, county infrastructure like roads, start working on plans to make those less vulnerable, to have natural progression to the stream corridor instead of armoring those roads and pushing that water other directions. I mean, we just saw that I-70 infrastructure. That's not so much that's a concern, but it's not a regulatory concern. County or city town priorities for preserving open space may have to do with development and requiring some dedication of open space, but it may also just have to do with the acquisition of land to preserve fluvial hazard zones. That last mapping, you could see that emergency preparedness and response would be super important for that existing development. And I thought that was a great point that Katie made about communication for existing development being really important. Many of those people may not understand where they're situated and that fluvial hazard potential to cut off access to I-70. So I think those are really important conversations to have. Likewise, this is just a broader version of that, but the landowner outreach, integrating this preservation of fluvial hazard zones in particular could be useful in conservation easements, or if local governments have a stream access easement, so they require access to a stream corridor to do maintenance work and restoration work, is starting to be more and more common. If you're doing that for your main stream corridor and you have your fluvial hazard zone mapping, it could be useful to have an access easement to do work in the fluvial hazard zone as well. I think you need to know what you want to do there first, but it could be helpful. But for the rest of today, we're spending our time in the world of incorporating into local regulation. But I think you got the takeaway there, which is that no matter what, it's a really, really valuable planning tool to have the fluvial hazard zones mapped to understand the hazard. And then from there, you're going to figure out what the approaches are, and it may include incorporating it into your regulations. Cool. So you've got your maps, you've been studying them, but you're still not sure whether to incorporate them into your local regulations. I put down like 3 questions that are probably where I'd start with, but I'm sure people could even chat some more questions that they would want. I'm sure the list is much longer than this. I just think that these are kind of the 3 that make sense to talk about at this level. As you start to look into your map, look into and understand the problem, you really need to know first and foremost to what extent is the fluvial hazard zone already developed. As we've already said, if most of that is already developed, and especially, I guess, understanding redevelopment potential as well, but if that area is already developed, then incorporating local regulation is not going to address the majority of the problems or the hazards coming from that fluvial zone. So that's really important. And I guess I imagine, and I'd be curious from others on this call who do have their maps, how much time after you develop your maps are you able to spend? I would think as a group sitting down and looking at where the problem areas are, where future development might occur. The other part of the conversation that's really important is what type of development is slated to occur in the future. So that's the broad way of talking about that. In like a local government planner speak, that would be, how is that land zoned? Because certain zones allow certain kinds of uses. You're almost always going to have some sort of allowance for residential, I would think, but also imagining for many of us what a river corridor quite often looks like. Sometimes there's a lot of zoning for industrial uses in that area. Of course, that matters just esoterically to understand the problem that you may be dealing with in the fluvial hazard zone. But the other reason that matters is because different types of uses have different levels of regulation that already exist in the local government's land use code. So heavy intensity industrial type activities may have to get already an intensive permit from the county or the town, like something like, they may call it a special use permit, a conditional use permit, but there's already a huge robust application that type of development would need to go through. Likely it already looks at what kind of hazards may be present in the area. It may call out specific types of hazards. Getting into the protection of the environmental functions of the fluvial hazard zone. There's likely some sort of analysis of water quality, of how the project would preserve the functionality of wetlands, water bodies, riparian areas on the site. And so it's important to understand what type of development is planned in the fluvial hazard zone, because you need to understand what kind of permits they're already getting before you can answer the question of whether or not you can leverage your existing regulations, or whether you need to create something new. So that's kind of where we're headed. But the initial question is really understanding what the development is and how it's already regulated in your code. And then the third one we've spent some time talking about internally, but I think that this, I guess I don't have a lot of solutions for it, but I think that there's a range of options of how you incorporate regulations, or you address fluvial hazards through regulation, and the political will to address the problem really sets the tone for how in depth you can go. I think if there's a lot of skepticism for the need for this, or how this might impact private property owners, then there may be the best approach may be the short and sweet, adjust your existing regulations, but don't develop this whole new permitting system for fluvial hazard zones. Vice versa, if your mapping shows what a huge problem this is going to be in the future, you may be set up to do the really big thing that really is going to be likely the most effective, but the goal is to do something and not have the perfect be the downfall of doing something. There's a better way to say that, but I'm not going to be able to come up with it right now. All right, let me make sure that was all I wanted to talk about on this slide. Yeah, I kind of hit on these two purposes of regulating. You're probably never going to pick one or the other of the purposes, but I think it's important to keep in mind that I think you may take different approaches to your regulations based on if you are looking at it through the lens of public safety versus protecting the environmental functions of the fluvial hazard zone, because those kind of sentiments may be, especially if you're working in your existing regulations, those are probably in two different places in your regulations. So I think that's why it matters more than you obviously would never ignore public safety and just go with protecting the environmental functions, but you need to consider both of them, but also consider how those are addressed in your regulations. And if you need to take two different paths and do two different sets of revisions. So that's why I think that's important to call out. Okay. Okay. Just wanted to go back to this example. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time there. I spent plenty of time earlier, but you can start thinking about, even in my tiny little example, which maybe is easier in some ways than trying to deal with the whole county, But, we can see that the fluvial hazard zone's already developed. Like I said, if you zoom in here, you can see some housing here. There is some potential industrial development, I think here. We'll just pretend that there is because I could be wrong. But there's definitely some potential for other types of development. We also have this railroad bridge you can see going across the Eagle portion of the river upstream of these properties. And depending on what's happening with this development, it may be already built out, or is there future development, and are there ways that we need to address that future development to do all the things Katie talked about to reduce the impacts especially if the stream or the river jumped its banks here and filled in this active stream corridor. So just wanted to come back to a visual. It helps me at least. Okay, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what kinds of regulations you might adopt, I want to spend just a little bit of time on philosophy. I also tried really hard to find a cartoon philosopher that was a woman, but it's actually really hard. Oh well, that's Socrates, supposedly. So I get it. They were all men in the day. All right, so regulatory philosophies. There's a couple of reasons why I think this is important. The first one, I guess, is starting with what Katie talked about. We're mitigating impacts of activities and of development. Philosophically, this is important, especially for the political will to work on this issue. Because I think on the other side of things, you can talk about how you're limiting the types of development that can happen places. And language really matters there, because we often tell people, clients that we're working with, that if you're mitigating the impacts of activities, you're really allowing someone to use their land up to and to the point that they're going to impact someone else's property, public health, and safety. And so that's philosophically an important distinction. And I think for folks to come back to that difference is we want to allow people to use their land up to and to the point where it's impacting others. And if it's impacting others, you need to mitigate that impact. Another thing that's important to think about when you're looking at any sort of new regulation is, do you want to take a prescriptive path that says, and I think floodplain regulations are a good example of this, with base elevation, and you have to preserve X amount of base elevation. And some of the ones that we've seen for fluvial hazard zones can be prescriptive too. You need to do, preserve X amount of energy. Oh gosh, I'm gonna mess up my terminology there, but there's numeric kind of limits you put on new development, and we call those prescriptive standards. You have to meet this specific standard. A lot of the regulations that we draft are performance-based standards. What that means is you tell an applicant, and just note that this is going to be the more sophisticated applicant. Like, you're probably not going to be doing this for a single family home unless you decide to do it for a single family home that's in the fluvial hazard zone. But in general, performance-based standards are for more sophisticated, more complex projects. But you're going to ask the applicant to show you how they are going to minimize impacts to neighboring properties, to public health and safety from fluvial hazards. And so you have a really broad performance-based standard, and you make the applicant do the work, and the applicant has the burden to demonstrate to the county how they have met this. And so they can do it through a number of different ways. The county doesn't prescribe the way that they do it, but they could move the site. They could, I don't even think I know the full suite of ways that they could mitigate, but they're hiring expert engineers to tell them, the applicant, how they are going to address fluvial hazards. And then the county can come in, and the applicant generally would pay for actually a county consultant expert who can help the county understand if the applicant has met their burden of minimizing impacts from fluvial hazard zones. So that's the approach we take quite often, because like we keep talking about, it's not a one size fits all how you even mitigate for those fluvial hazards. So that's an important philosophical point there. We've talked a lot already about tailoring your regulations. The political will piece is much harder if your regulations are not tailored to match the scale of the problem, and then also to match the scale or intensity of development. So, what you're going to require for large industrial or for like a gravel pit the types of application materials you would require for an applicant would be very different than single family housing. And so you really need solutions, especially for this type of hazard, you need solutions, probably different solutions for both of them, because one of them is going to be more onerous, the consequences are bigger. One of them could be scaled back for smaller scale development. All right, so tailoring, as you would imagine, there's going to be a less intensive approach to regulations, and we're going to start there, which is just integrating the hazard zone into your existing regulations, or the most intensive, I think, is creating some sort of an overlay district and an additional permit that an applicant would need to get if you were in a fluvial hazard zone overlay district. Okay, integrating this work into your existing regulation. I think that this is low-hanging fruit for anyone that has fluvial hazard zone mapping. Quite often for these, like I said, larger scale project, like a special use permit type project, industrial, the gravel pit that we were just talking about, also a lot of commercial type uses of a gas station, I don't know, any sort of bigger uses than like single family residential, including subdivision, plan unit developments. You're usually going to have some sort of a requirement in there that the applicant needs to explain why the project's not subject to the risk of natural hazards and is not going to exacerbate existing natural hazard risks. We think it's always better to call out the types of hazards that you're thinking about. You can say, you know, like including but not limited to. So like technically you could still ask the applicant to respond to fluvial hazard zone problems, but it's even better if you call it out and the applicant knows from the beginning that this county has mapped fluvial hazard zones. You need to use that map, and if you're popping up in there, you need to explain this is a classic performance-based standard. And then I already mentioned this one too, but likewise, those types of, like most communities already have some type of standard about not significantly degrading basically the ecological function of rivers, streams, floodplains, wetlands, riparian areas. You may, depending on where you're located, you may mention fens. So it's always helpful to have that list. And I think it's really helpful to explicitly call out fluvial hazard zones because it may be something that applicants are just not even aware of as an issue. So literally by adding these things to existing lists in your regulations, I think that's like going miles towards pointing out and having that transparency to applicants that they need to think about that. So to me, this is like really the low-hanging fruit. All right, then I'll go through or at least this one pretty quickly because Katie already talked about some of the incentive-based things that many local governments have built into their regulations. If you do these things, you may get a density bonus. If you use the cluster subdivision statutes and you have cluster subdivisions, you can get additional like kind of points for preserving the fluvial hazard zone and taking development out of the fluvial hazard zone. Some communities, I know Summit County does. Nicole might have time to talk about how much Pitkin County is able to use their transfer of development rights. But that idea is that the county would either pay or incentivize through some other way like density bonuses, that if you move your development right either within the site or off-site to another location, you get a whole package of incentives and possibly even some money for doing that. So transferring development rights off of fluvial hazard zone areas could be really effective. And I think that's like a middle ground, especially depending on if you already have that kind of incentive-based program. Sometimes they talk about like you get these kind of bonuses for any environmentally sensitive areas. And if you don't list them already, then fluvial hazard zones, I think, are already included in there. The overlay district is I think the most complex, but it is how you are going to be able to most directly address impacts from development occurring in a hazard zone. So it's the big one. It's going to be the most effective, but depending on political will, depending on you know, what you've learned from your mapping, you may not need to go all the way to the big one. But it's really important It's a really important one. So an overlay district, you have your existing, we've talked about zoning that allows different uses in different areas. An overlay district ignores existing zoning, and you still have all those existing zoning requirements, but over top of that, overlaid, is a district that has its own set of requirements. It doesn't matter what kind of zoning you're in. Otherwise, if you're in this overlay district, you also have to meet the requirements of the overlay district. And so that district, generally the way that that's done is that you need a permit if you're in that district, and you have to show that you meet all the requirements of that particular district. The CWCB's done a model overlay district. Chaffee County recently adopted that. There's some examples you can see there of the type of requirements that an applicant needs to demonstrate. So there's a lot more that's going to go into demonstration of how you're minimizing impacts to the fluvial hazard zone and to neighboring properties. I think I am almost done, just so folks know it's taking longer as usual. But anyway, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we are running out of time, except just to plug you again to think about if your thinking has changed since we first put this map up about all the different tools that you might employ to address some of the concerns, I think especially in like this area, but also thinking about if there's any sort of development that was happening in this undeveloped area that would be sending down additional hazards into this community also. And I think that, for me at least, that includes regulation, but it also includes a lot of the other things on that initial list. And you can see why, if your hazard mapping looked differently, you would tailor regulations to match exactly what the concerns are you're seeing in your community. All right, since I am running low on time, Brian, I'm just gonna like take this real quick, but this is one, what we talked about today is one small piece of some of the work that River Network's been doing. I help them with fluvial hazard zones, but they've been doing a lot of work in general on integrated river management, and they have a guidebook coming out that captures all that work. And I actually was kind of excited to see, but I think all these like 4 sectors of integrated river management that they've identified, you can see them in the table of contents too, but really we covered all of those today. So any of your river management issues you're looking at in your community, I think that you're always going to end up hitting all 4 of those. And so that's coming out. When's that coming out, Brian? Any day now, there's going to be a guidebook. And it's not focused specifically on fluvial hazard zones, but there's a lot more information in there and much broader. You can see like these principles, like we lived in the world today of regulations, but there's a lot more in that guidebook coming out. So I just wanted to flag that for people as an existing resource. But I think that's it. I hope you learned something from that. It definitely was a high level philosophy of regulation, probably maybe more than nuts and bolts, but sometimes nuts and bolts put you to sleep. So, all right, Nicole, wake us up again from my theoretical.
Thanks, Tori.
Yeah.
Nicole, we're not hearing you. So Nicole Rebeck-Stout is Deputy Planning Director for Pitkin County, and they currently are having some fluvial hazard zone maps created as part of the Wildfire Ready Action Plan. So they're starting to think about how to use them and adopt them. Still can't hear you. Sorry, we should have tested you up front. So while Nicole's working on that, and Nicole, I'll stop talking as soon as we can get. Oh, there you go.
I figured it.
Yeah.
I figured it out. Sorry.
Great. No worries.
Um,
Thanks again for joining us here.
Okay. Hi, my name is Nicole Rebeck-Stout. I'm Deputy Director of Community Development in Pitkin County. I'm one of my responsibilities is to manage the development review function of our department, and we're sort of one of those counties that has a lot of regulations surrounding either avoiding hazards or mitigating for hazards. That process is already in place for all development and redevelopment. So no one can skirt around a sort of lengthy review process. And so what our struggle that we've had is we don't have fluvial hazards currently in our code, our land use code. However, when we identify a floodplain or other geologic hazards, we refer that application to Colorado Geologic Survey, and then they have brought to our attention if a property is most likely within a fluvial hazard zone. So we don't have a map, but CGS has sort of studied some of the sites that have come across their desk and sort of identified sort of obvious fluvial hazard issues, like if a development is near an oxbow, for example. And so we've actually required applicants to study that hazard within the application process, which is great. However, our ideal scenario is that we just have clear expectations in our land use code and in our application requirements to sort of solve for the fluvial hazard zone. So where we are, we've sort of taken Chaffee County as a lesson. We've connected with Chaffee County in terms of their process, in terms of adopting the FHZ model ordinance. And we're, our plan now is to issue an RFQ to secure a consultant team, not only to help us with our fluvial hazard zone regulations, but also floodplain and honestly our full geologic hazard regulation suite. We'd like to address that all together. So that is coming later this year, that request for qualifications. And in terms of sort of the policy foundation for these, I think they already exist in our existing long range documents. However, we are also taking on a comprehensive plan rewrite in which a draft is available for public inspection right now. And we've gotten more clear about identifying hazards, mitigating for hazards, avoiding hazards in that comp plan. So we'll have a good foundation to go from whenever our regulations come forth. I think our current code, the thing that Tori didn't mention that I would like to add in terms of regulations is our current code would allow anyone to replace any development sort of regardless of where they're located in terms of hazards. So floodplain is a good example. So if someone has a legally created structure that was built in the 60s, right on the water, that's where everybody wants to be, someone could buy that property, scrape that house, and basically rebuild the same house in the same footprint. What we need to address with our nonconformity section is what's a fair nonconformity to bring back, and what options does an applicant have to actually come into compliance with current code, or should we require them to come into compliance with current code? So, logically, I think differently about, bringing back a garage that was built in a yard setback, sort of outside of site constraints, versus, someone who's building a house in the floodplain when there's ample space available on the lot that would avoid hazards. So I think that is a topic we're going to explore with this RFQ team that just to sort of build upon what Tori mentioned in terms of like the regulatory family of topics that need to be addressed when we're thinking of integrating fluvial hazard regulations. And thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Well, really appreciate all this discussion from Tori and Nicole, some specific questions and ideas and concerns. And like Nicole and Pickens County are going to be exploring all this over the coming year or so. If people have questions, please type it in the chat and we can field those questions for Nicole and Tori or ourselves. But then while that's happening, Nicole, I'll just cue one up for you and Tori. So you have a comp plan that you're redoing. It doesn't explicitly mention FHZs, but in our discussion earlier, it's like you have hazard mitigation as a focus or something that you all want to address. And so this is like a piece that can fit into that. And Katie asked this question too, is how do you envision, or I guess how does a hazard code work in Pickens County, and how could the FHZ better inform that?
Well, I do want to clarify, Joel, I think last time we spoke, I said our draft comp plan doesn't say the word fluvial hazard, and I just checked. It does.
Oh, nice. Even better.
Yeah.
It doesn't help
So
too.
there you go. So yeah, and like I said, the sort of basis of our land use code and the sort of application requirements for development is the activity envelope and site plan review process. And at the very core of that function, of that application is to identify site constraints on the property, hazards on the property, and how the applicant can either avoid those or mitigate for those. So that framework is already there, which I think is sort of half the battle, like Tori was mentioning. So it's really just baking this in. To put it quite simply, it's going to be a huge process. I don't want to minimize what all is involved, but the policy foundation is there, and I think the framework for development review is also there.
So you've got the framework and then the baking in part. What does that look like for a new hazard layer like FHZ?
I'll just chime in really quick. Yeah. My short answer is I don't know. I'm sort of open for all of it. You know, when I saw that Chaffee County did a zoning overlay, I really thought, I don't know if that's right for us to do it that way. But I'm really going into this process with an open mind. I think I feel like a lot of what we'll end up with will sort of emerge from where we start. So defining those goals, like Tori was describing, in terms of how much are we thinking about public safety versus are protecting our natural environment. I really think that both of those are of value in Pickens County and organizing development in Pickens County. So I'm sort of, like I said, Joel, I'm up for anything, and I really think it's going to be a result of the team we put together to tell that story. And I'd love to do a webinar next year to share that out.
Yeah. Well, and really broadly, some of those general standards that I put up on the screen, you know, the applicant needs to show how the project will minimize impacts to the fluvial hazard zone, along with all the other hazards that may be present. Whether or not it says fluvial hazard zone, just the other missing piece to me is like, once you have that hazard mapping is really just like internal education, because the staff has the ability to kick back an application and just say over and over again, yes, like, this application is not even complete. We can't even review it until you address fluvial hazard zones. And so even if it doesn't say it, even if you haven't amended your regulations, but you have something about hazards, then staff can can do that and use their existing information. So I think that's just like the biggest next step, is making sure the planning department knows what the engineering, what the newest layers are, and kicks back applications if they don't address them.
And that is our process right now. And Katie, I see your question in the chat about describing other hazards. So I just pulled up chapter 7 of our land use code. This is our development standard. So there's site constraints and hazards baked into this, but it's not all constraints. So we consider site preparation and grading, steep and unstable slopes, water courses and drainage, floodplain, geologic hazards, wildfire, wildlife habitat areas, river and stream corridors and wetlands, historically irrigated lands for crop and food production, historic preservation assets, and archaeological resources, and scenic view protection, landscape and vegetation protection. Those are all site considerations when application comes into us for development review. And I'm happy to drop this link. I live in chapter 7, so there you go.
I just want to acknowledge it's 11. I'm happy to keep this discussion going if Tori and Nicole can for some more minutes, but if you need to go, no worries. Political will here. So from Brad Robinstein, when we talked about this a little bit, because ultimately new regulations potentially or new level of review, we might get some pushback from local landowners, even your county commissioners. How do you see yourself approaching that in Pickens County? And granted, every county is going to have a different set of politics.
That's a really good question, Joel. And we have not brought this forth to our county commissioners. We're intending on hosting a work session with the BOCC to sort of do a pulse test with them. I think conceptually they'll be interested in anything that is going to help our local environment and waterways thrive and improve public safety conceptually. And it, I haven't even seen a map of a fluvial hazard zone in Pickens County. So a lot of it might have to do with the scale of the hazard, which I understand it to be at least moderate or significant in all of Pickens County's waterways. So I guess the short answer is I don't have a really great strategy for the BOCC, but I think if we always go back to their values as elected officials and share out the benefits that it'll provide for the future of this county, that's going to be the strength of the discussion. And they do have a lot on their plate. I mean, like I said, we're in this comp plan process. I know that's the P&Z Commission adoption, but the BOCC is participating. And then, as you know, the state's requiring the resiliency code to be adopted for wildfire later this year, which basically increases the wildfire hazard all across our county. So there's, it's going to be tough, but I think it's also a little bit of a reality check. Like, we are living amongst hazards. Let's not bury our head in the sand. Let's confront this. And like Tori described, there's options. So let's see what feels the best for us.
Yeah, I have like a couple of thoughts to add, because totally agree. I think to start where you ended is like the options, not getting ahead of mapping. I think like if you haven't done the mapping yet, do that first, and then just remind elected officials or anyone that you may not need new regulation, but we need to know where the problem areas are. So I think it's important not to jump to regulation, because I think that does trigger a lot of concern for folks. Do the mapping first. Sadly, I think this is a good time to have the conversations. I'm kind of curious. I haven't gotten to talk to Joel and Katie and Michael about this, but I mean, what happened in Texas with the Camp Mystic, it is tragic. And I just keep wondering if there are those kind of problem areas in a county, like could mapping and then taking the next steps after mapping help with that? That's pretty compelling to me.
Yeah.
And then the last one is also making like the connection to other concerns. So with, like Nicole mentioned, wildfire, and understanding fluvial hazard zones can help understand post-wildfire debris flow and where that might change. And so, yeah, as much as you can leverage what their other priorities are and make all those connections will help.
And the point of, having the map and communicating this to your political officials and your manager office, et cetera, is that it's not a new hazard, right? It's a hazard that exists. And by highlighting it, to your point, Tori, we can avoid bad things happening. And these are hazards that might not be captured by a floodplain map. They're not just inundation hazards. They're where the river moves or could incorporate an influence over time. So yeah, really, really great points. Well, I feel like this might be a good point to wrap up. And Nicole, maybe we can revisit with y'all and see how your journey has gone over the next year. But really appreciate everyone's time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Tori, thank you so much. And Katie, join us again. Katie, if you don't mind, if you could get that slide up for the upcoming webinars, you can register through a Google form and we'll get you on our mailing list for that. And actually, I might try to do that real quick before everyone signs off. You can also see us at CASFM coming up in September and Sustaining Colorado Watersheds. So I'm going to just share my screen real quick, unless Katie's going to beat me. And there's the QR code right there. So September 16th, we'll hear from the city of Greeley. So they are maybe a little bit farther ahead, and they're kind of on the ground starting to look at planning and master planning around the FHZ as they re-engage with their river corridor. So that's on the 16th. Register here with this QR code, and then we'll have a more generic fluvial opportunity zone discussion in October. So we'll tell you more about that. You'll find our recordings here at coloradofhz.com, previous things, and then here's the information for CASFM, as well as SCW, Sustaining Colorado Watersheds. All right, appreciate it, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, guys.
Great. Thanks, Nicole. Really appreciate your time. And Tori, too.